An important part of a successful woodworking project is knowing which tool to use when. The difference between the crosscut tooth and the ripping tooth is significant. The crosscut saw is surprisingly effective at cutting across the grain, and the ripping tooth is surprisingly effective at cutting parallel to the grain. In this video, I'll show you the difference and dig a little bit deeper into why that is. This bundle of straws represents what's happening inside a tree on a cellular level. So if you were to look at the end of a piece of wood using a microscope, you would see all of these open straws. And those open straws transmit water from the roots up the tree and out to the leaves. When you look sideways at the same piece of wood, it looks very different on a microscopic level. We have many cell walls to get through to be able to cut the wood in that direction. That's called a crosscut. Cutting in this direction is called a rip cut. And when you're ripping, the saw is running parallel to those straws. And that illustrates nicely the need for different teeth depending on which cut you're making. So the crosscut requires smaller, slightly more complex teeth to cut through all of those cell walls. The ripping tooth is a much simpler tooth, and it's really just raking material out of the way rather than cutting through it in this direction. I have 3 examples of saws up here. All of the saws I'm showing you are Japanese saws, meaning that the teeth are angled back toward the handle. They cut on the pull stroke. So all of the work that you're doing takes place as you're drawing the saw toward you. You never worry about the saw buckling as a result. And I also think it's a lot easier to guide your cut if you're trying to cut to a square line or to a score line. If you look carefully at the teeth, this saw has a crosscut tooth and this saw has a ripping tooth. The ripping tooth is very simple. It is ground perpendicular to the blade and just presents a chiseled tooth at the top of the tooth, which is the cutting edge of the saw. If you look carefully at the crosscut tooth, you'll see that it is much more complicated. There is a bevel ground on alternating sides on the teeth, and the tooth is actually sharpened on the side, so as you're pulling it through the wood, it is slicing on the side of the tooth. And then there's a third bevel ground on the top side of the tooth, which is the part of the tooth that is cutting into the wood as you're sawing, and that edge is also sharpened. The teeth are generally finer on a crosscut tooth than on the ripping tooth, and that all comes down to what it is you're trying to do. When you're cutting perpendicular to the grain, you're cutting a lot more surface area, and you need to slice that to remove it. When you're cutting parallel to the grain, you're often cutting between cells, and you're just trying to drag that wood out. You're not actually slicing and cutting it the way you are when you're cross-cutting. So as a result, the teeth are shaped very differently, because they're doing a different job depending on how you're cutting relative to the grain of the wood. Now I'm going to grab a piece of wood and just demonstrate the difference. All right, so for this first demonstration, I'm going to use the Ryoba saw. Again, I'm going to start with the crosscut tooth, the slightly more complex tooth, to make a cut perpendicular to the grain. So one of the ways you can tell that you're using the right tooth for the application is that you're getting relatively large pieces of sawdust rather than very, very fine powder. So that crosscut tooth does a beautiful job of slicing perpendicular to the grain. Now I'm going to flip the saw over and use the much simpler ripping tooth. I'm going to cut in parallel to the grain and remove this chunk of wood. This is similar to the operation we would use when we're cutting the tenon on the end of a timber. And in both cases, you can see that the saw blade left a decent finish in each of the 2 different applications. Now, if I were to take the ripping tooth and try to cut across the grain, the saw is very ineffective. Doesn't want to make that cut. It's tending to just bounce. You can see that it's just sort of tearing the wood, and it doesn't leave a clean cut. The same is true of the crosscut tooth in a ripping application. It is just refusing to cut, right? So I cut maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so. It doesn't want to bite into the wood. It's not designed for that cutting application. So you'll notice on the two sets of saws on the edges here, we have two different saws. In the middle, we have a Ryoba. This is made by Gyokucho, and you'll see that there are teeth on both sides of the blade. So while this saw functionally is the same as these two or the same as these two, the blade is obviously a little bit different in that we have a crosscut tooth on one side of the blade and a ripping tooth on the other. This is great because it's very convenient. You have one handle, one saw to carry around with you, and it allows you to cut both across the grain and parallel to the grain. The slight downside to this style is that if you damage one side, whether it's the ripping tooth or the crosscut tooth, you need to replace the whole blade. Just remove this screw and the blade comes out and you can install a new one. So a slight advantage to keeping the teeth on a separate handle, separate blade is that if I damage just the crosscut tooth, I can replace just the crosscut blade. It is very often handy to have both capabilities. We mostly do timber framing type work, so a great example of needing both of those applications is when you're cutting a tenon. So you'll make one cut near the end of the beam, which is the shoulder cut, that is a cross cut, and then you'll make a second cut in from the end on the cheek of the tenon, and now you can remove a rectangular piece of wood and expose one half of the tenon. Having both of these blades is super convenient for many different woodworking projects. In the case of the Z-saw, the teeth have been impulse hardened. That process involves running electricity, high voltage electricity, down the tip of the tooth. You can see that a saw is impulse hardened by looking carefully at the tooth, and you'll see that it's discolored. So this is a bluish, blackish color on the tip of the tooth, and that is true for both the ripping tooth and the crosscut tooth. That creates a tooth that is incredibly hard. The blade itself stays flexible, right? We're not hardening this part, we're only hardening the part that's doing the cutting work. Impulse hardening creates a steel that is so hard it cannot be sharpened. You would actually dull your files by trying to grind these teeth. So this is considered a replaceable blade. When this becomes dull because you've hit metal or you've simply worn away that very sharp edge over time, it's time to just replace the blade. You basically tap the back of the blade on something hard, not your wood surface, and that springs the blade out, and then you can put in a new blade. And you'll notice at the front edge, we have this area where there are no teeth. You would knock that against, again, something hard to lock the blade into place. I always like to keep the old blades because sometimes I'm doing something that I probably shouldn't be doing with a handsaw, like cutting through drywall or cutting through wood that might contain metal in it. Use your old blades, it's a lot safer. Over here on the Japanese timber saws, you'll notice that the handle is somewhat permanently attached to the blade. So these saws are intended and able to be sharpened, but again, it is challenging to sharpen the crosscut tooth because of the very precise angles on both sides of the teeth and that top bevel, but it is possible. I would never do it. I tried it once, very unsuccessfully. The saw actually seemed duller than before I had sharpened it. What causes these blades to get dull? Well, the biggest thing is just heat. So if you're cutting very dry, very hard wood, it's a good idea to just saw slowly. If you're not generating a lot of heat, you're not eroding that very finely ground cutting edge that's doing all the work of removing the wood. If you tend to saw very quickly, you're going to generate more heat at the tip of the tooth, right? The steel comes down to a very small point. So it's easy to generate enough heat in that very, very small area of steel to actually start eroding the cutting edge. And of course, once you do that, you have a rounded edge. It's not as crisp as it was when it was sharpened at the manufacturer, so it's going to remove wood less effectively. I hope that demonstration illustrated the effectiveness of the two different teeth, and I hope you get to try the two different teeth in a woodworking project of your own soon.